March 1942. A British general stands in the jungle darkness of Burma, watching his army disintegrate. Behind him, 900 miles to the north, thousands of soldiers, civilians, and refugees are stumbling through mountains and disease-ridden forests in the longest military retreat in British history. Ahead of him, the Japanese army is advancing with a speed that seems almost supernatural, crushing everything in its path. This is the moment the British Empire begins to die in Asia. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. What started as Britain's most humiliating defeat would transform into one of the most remarkable comebacks in military history. A comeback led by one of World War II's strangest generals. A comeback that would birth modern special operations warfare. A comeback that would ultimately save China, prevent Japan from linking up with Nazi Germany, and determine who would control Asia for the next 80 years. This is the story of the Burma Campaign, the forgotten war that was fought in the worst conditions imaginable, where more soldiers died from disease than bullets, where men fought in jungles so thick that armies could pass within yards of each other without knowing it, where the thermometer hit 110 degrees and the rainfall measured in feet, not inches. A war that involved British, Indian, Chinese, American, Japanese, and Burmese forces in a 3-year slugfest that stretched across an area the size of Texas. A war that produced some of history's most innovative military units, the Chindits, the Marauders, the Flying Tigers. A war that almost nobody remembers today. But if Japan had won in Burma, the entire map of Asia would look different right now. India might have fallen, China might have collapsed. The Allies might have lost the Pacific War before they even had a chance to fight back. This is the story of how the British Empire lost Burma in 3 months, and then spent 3 years clawing it back through hell. The jewel they couldn't defend. To understand why Burma mattered so much, you need to understand what Burma was in 1941. Burma, modern-day Myanmar, was a British colony wedged between India to the west and China to the east. It was a country of stunning geographic extremes, dense tropical jungles in the south, towering mountain ranges in the north, rivers that flooded so dramatically during monsoon season that they became impassable torrents, and forests so thick that British officers described them as green walls where visibility was measured in feet. The population was diverse: ethnic Burmans, Karens, Shans, Kachins, Chinese immigrants, and British administrators, all living in an uneasy colonial peace. The capital, Rangoon, was a prosperous port city that looked like a tropical version of British India: colonial architecture, bustling markets, and a harbor full of merchant ships. But Burma's real strategic value wasn't its cities or its people. It was its position on the map. Burma was the back door to British India, the crown jewel of the British Empire, home to 400 million people, and the source of massive British wealth and military manpower. If Japan conquered Burma, they'd be positioned to invade India itself. Even more importantly, Burma was China's last lifeline to the outside world. By 1941, China had been fighting Japan for 4 brutal years. The Japanese had conquered China's entire coastline, captured all its major ports, and driven the nationalist Chinese government deep into the interior. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek had relocated his capital to Chongqing, hundreds of miles inland, where he was barely holding on. China was receiving supplies from the Allies through exactly one route, the Burma Road. This was a 717-mile engineering marvel carved through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. It snaked from Rangoon through the Burmese jungles, climbed into the mountains, crossed into China's Yunnan province, and finally reached Chongqing. Every truck that rumbled along that road carried ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and hope. If Japan cut the Burma Road, China would be strangled. And if China fell, Japan could redeploy millions of soldiers currently tied down in China to threaten India, Australia, and the entire Pacific theater. That's why Burma mattered. It was the hinge upon which the entire Asian theater of World War II turned. And in December 1941, that hinge was about to snap. The fall, Japan's unstoppable advance. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor burns. The same day, Japanese forces attack the Philippines, Hong Kong, Thailand, and Malaya. Within hours, the entire Pacific explodes into war. Britain is already stretched impossibly thin. They're fighting Nazi Germany in Europe and North Africa. Their best troops, best equipment, and best commanders are all deployed elsewhere. What's left to defend their Asian empire? Garrison forces, colonial troops, and wishful thinking. The defense of Burma fell to a hodgepodge force that nobody thought would actually have to fight. A few British battalions, Indian Army units, many of them raw recruits, Burmese colonial forces of questionable loyalty, maybe 30,000 troops total to defend a country the size of Texas. Leading this unprepared army was Lieutenant General Thomas Hutton, a competent administrator who'd spent most of his career behind a desk. He had virtually no tanks, limited air support, and a defensive plan based on the assumption that the jungle was impenetrable and therefore didn't need defending. The Japanese thought differently. In January 1942, the Japanese 15th Army crossed from Thailand into Burma. Leading them was Lieutenant General Shojiro Ida, and he had approximately 35,000 troops, not overwhelmingly superior in numbers, but vastly superior in everything else that mattered. The Japanese soldiers were veterans. They'd spent years fighting in China. They were trained in jungle warfare, river crossings, night attacks, and living off the land. Their tactics were aggressive to the point of recklessness. Rapid advances, infiltration, encirclement, and the terrifying jitterbug tactic, where small units would slip through British lines at night, causing chaos in the rear. And they had air superiority. Japanese fighters and bombers controlled the skies. British and American aircraft were few, outdated, and quickly overwhelmed. The Japanese advance was shockingly fast. They moved through terrain the British had declared impassable. They attacked from directions the British thought were impossible. They used bicycles to move quickly along jungle trails. They crossed rivers on improvised rafts. They seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The British and Indian troops fought bravely, but were consistently outmaneuvered. The Japanese would pin them frontally, while simultaneously sending forces around their flanks. British commanders would suddenly discover Japanese roadblocks in their rear, cutting off their retreat routes. Units would be surrounded, forced to fight their way out or surrender. On March 8, 1942, Rangoon fell, the capital of Burma, abandoned after demolitions to deny its facilities to the Japanese. The loss of Rangoon meant the loss of Burma's only major port. From now on, Allied forces would have to be supplied by air or through treacherous mountain roads from India. But the retreat didn't stop at Rangoon. It couldn't. The Japanese kept coming. What followed was the longest fighting retreat in British military history. For 3 months, British, Indian, and the remnants of Burmese forces stumbled north, fighting desperate rearguard actions, abandoning equipment, losing cohesion. They were joined by approximately 600,000 refugees, Indian and Anglo-Indian civilians who'd lived in Burma and now faced Japanese occupation. These refugees walked alongside the retreating soldiers, carrying whatever they could, dying by the thousands from exhaustion, disease, starvation, and Japanese air attacks. The retreat route led through hell. First, the lowland jungles where temperatures exceeded 100 degrees and humidity was suffocating. Then the rivers, swollen by early monsoon rains, crossed on makeshift ferries while Japanese aircraft strafed the crossing points. Finally, the mountains, steep, roadless, infested with malaria-carrying mosquitoes and leeches. Disease was worse than combat: malaria, dysentery, cholera, typhus. Soldiers would collapse from fever and be left beside the trail. Civilians would sit down to rest and never stand up again. Corpses lined the retreat routes. By May 1942, the survivors stumbled across the border into India. They'd lost Burma completely. The Japanese now controlled the entire country and had closed the Burma Road, severing China's last supply line. The statistics were devastating. The British had lost approximately 13,000 casualties. But more importantly, they'd lost confidence, prestige, and the aura of invincibility that had maintained colonial control. Throughout Asia, colonized peoples watched the British Empire retreat in disarray before an Asian army. The myth of European racial and military superiority was shattered. Anti-colonial movements across Asia gained momentum. Japan had won one of the most complete victories of World War II, and now they stood on the border of India, poised for an even greater prize. But there was a problem with the Japanese victory. It looked complete, but it wasn't final. The British had escaped, battered, humiliated, but intact. And they were about to hand command to a general who would turn this catastrophe into something extraordinary. His name was William Slim, and he understood something about jungle warfare that would change everything. The strange generals. Every great military comeback needs the right leader. And in 1942, the British found possibly the only man who could pull off what came next. Lieutenant General William Slim was the anti-hero of British generals. He wasn't aristocratic. He'd risen from lower middle-class origins through sheer competence. He wasn't flashy. He wore rumpled uniforms and spoke in a straightforward, unpretentious manner. He wasn't even particularly liked by the British establishment, who viewed him as too common, too blunt, too willing to criticize the old ways. But Slim understood soldiers. He'd served as an enlisted man in World War I, been wounded twice, and worked his way up through the ranks. He'd commanded Indian Army units and respected the non-British troops that made up the bulk of his forces. Most importantly, he thought deeply about warfare and was willing to innovate. When Slim took command of what would become the 14th Army in October 1943, he inherited a force that was thoroughly beaten psychologically. They'd been defeated repeatedly by the Japanese. They believed the Japanese were invincible jungle fighters. They believed the terrain was impassable. They believed they couldn't win. Slim's first job was changing that mindset. He visited every unit personally. He talked to soldiers directly, not as a distant commander, but as someone who understood their fears. He asked what they needed, what they'd learned, what had gone wrong. And then he fixed things. He improved medical care, dramatically reducing disease rates. He ensured better food and supplies. He created better jungle warfare training. He told his troops explicitly that the Japanese were not supermen. They were simply soldiers who'd learned to use the jungle, and that meant British and Indian soldiers could learn too. He also recognized something that other British commanders had missed. His Indian Army troops weren't inferior fighters. They were magnificent soldiers who'd been poorly led, poorly equipped, and poorly trained. Give them good leadership and proper training, and they'd match anyone. Slim's 14th Army became a genuinely multi-ethnic force. British, Indian, Gurkha, African, and Burmese troops all fighting together with mutual respect. It would become known as the Forgotten Army, because they fought far from the spotlight of European warfare, but they'd earned that name with pride. But Slim wasn't the only unconventional commander in Burma. Enter Orde Wingate, possibly the strangest general in British military history. Wingate was a combination of military genius and complete lunatic. He was deeply religious, abrasive, ate raw onions, wore an alarm clock on his wrist, and once received a superior officer while naked and brushing himself with a wire brush. He argued with everyone, alienated superiors, and had ideas that most considered insane. His idea for Burma was the Chindits, long-range penetration groups that would operate deep behind Japanese lines, supplied entirely by air, disrupting communications and spreading chaos. Most British officers thought this was suicide, but Winston Churchill loved it. It was bold, aggressive, and unconventional, everything Churchill admired. In early 1943, Wingate led 3,000 men on the first Chindit expedition. They marched hundreds of miles behind Japanese lines, blew up railways, attacked supply dumps, and generally caused havoc. Of the 3,000 men, only 2,000 returned, many of them wrecked by disease and exhaustion. Militarily, the first Chindit operation achieved little, but psychologically it was huge. It proved that British forces could operate in the jungle, that they could outfight the Japanese, that the enemy wasn't invincible. Wingate's second operation in 1944 was even more ambitious. Gliders and transport planes, dropping entire brigades deep into Burma to establish fortified bases and cut Japanese supply lines. It was innovative, costly, and controversial. Wingate himself died in an air crash during the operation. But the Chindits changed jungle warfare. They pioneered air supply techniques. They proved that forces could operate independently behind enemy lines. They forced the Japanese to divert troops to deal with them. And then there were the Americans. The United States had its own interests in Burma, keeping China in the war. If China collapsed, 1 million Japanese soldiers would be freed up for operations elsewhere. So, America poured resources into keeping China supplied, aircraft, supplies, and men. Leading the American effort was Lieutenant General Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell, a man whose nickname perfectly captured his personality. Stilwell was abrasive, brutally honest, contemptuous of incompetence, and obsessed with actually fighting rather than playing politics. He commanded Chinese forces in Burma, troops that he'd trained and equipped according to American standards. He walked out of Burma with his troops during the 1942 retreat, covering over 140 miles on foot at age 59, and declaring, "I claim we got a hell of a beating. We got run out of Burma, and it is humiliating as hell." Stilwell didn't do spin, but he did do results. Working with Stilwell was Major General Frank Merrill, who commanded a special operations unit that became known as Merrill's Marauders. Like the Chindits, they operated behind Japanese lines, but with American-style aggression and Chinese-style endurance. And in the air, there was General Claire Chennault and his Flying Tigers, the American volunteer group that had been fighting in China since before Pearl Harbor. They flew supplies over the Hump, the treacherous air route over the Himalayas that replaced the Burma Road. Hundreds of aircraft, thousands of flights, an aerial supply line that kept China alive. All of these commanders, Slim, Wingate, Stilwell, Merrill, Chennault, were mavericks in their own ways. They didn't fit the traditional military mold. They argued with superiors. They innovated. They took risks. And in Burma's impossible conditions, that's exactly what was needed. Because by 1944, the Japanese were about to make their own bold gamble, an invasion of India itself. And when they did, these strange generals would be ready. The turning point, Imphal and Kohima. March 1944. The Japanese launched Operation U-Go, the invasion of India. Their target was the twin cities of Imphal and Kohima in northeast India. These weren't just any cities. Imphal was the major British supply base for the entire Burma front. Kohima controlled the only road into Imphal. Capture both, and the British position would collapse. The road to India would be open. The Japanese plan was audacious. 3 divisions, approximately 85,000 men, would cross from Burma into India through mountains the British considered impassable. They'd carry minimal supplies, living off captured British stockpiles. They'd move fast, strike hard, and be in eventual before the British could react. It was classic Japanese military thinking, bold, aggressive, and logistically insane. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, believed in spiritual strength over material resources. He expected his soldiers to march through mountains, carrying 3 weeks of supplies, and to forage for the rest. He launched the offensive at the start of the monsoon season, when movement would be hardest. He ignored warnings from his own staff that the logistics wouldn't work. This was Japanese military culture at its most extreme, the belief that willpower could overcome reality. Initially, the offensive worked. Japanese forces surged forward, infiltrated British positions, and cut the road to Imphal. By early April, Imphal was surrounded. Kohima was under direct attack. The siege of Kohima became one of World War II's most desperate battles. The town sat on a hilltop with the main position centered around the district commissioner's bungalow and its tennis court. The fighting was so close that grenades were thrown back and forth across the tennis court. British and Japanese soldiers were sometimes separated by meters, shooting at each other across what had been a peaceful colonial garden. The garrison, about 1,500 men initially, held against repeated Japanese assaults. Supplies were dropped by air. Wounded men defended positions. They were too injured to leave. For 2 weeks, Kohima hung by a thread. At Imphal, the situation was equally desperate. The city was surrounded by 3 Japanese divisions. Over 150,000 British and Indian troops were trapped inside, supplied entirely by air, the largest air supply operation ever attempted at that time. But here's where Slim's preparations paid off. His 14th Army didn't panic. They'd trained for exactly this situation. They held their positions. They fought back aggressively, and most importantly, they had supplies. The Japanese, meanwhile, were starving. Mutaguchi's insane logistics plan was failing catastrophically. His soldiers had been expected to live off captured supplies, but they couldn't capture the British positions. They were supposed to forage, but there was nothing to forage in the jungle. The monsoon turned the mountain trails into rivers of mud, making resupply impossible. Japanese soldiers began to starve. Then they began to die of disease. Malaria, dysentery, and beriberi ravaged units that had no medical supplies. Wounded men couldn't be evacuated. They were left beside trails to die. And the British counterattacked. Relief columns fought their way to Kohima and broke the siege on April 18th. At Imphal, Slim's forces pushed outward, breaking the encirclement sector by sector. The Japanese, starving and disease-ridden, fought with suicidal determination but couldn't stop the British advance. By July 1944, Operation U-Go had collapsed completely. The Japanese retreated back into Burma in a disaster that made the 1942 British retreat look organized by comparison. Of the 85,000 Japanese soldiers who'd invaded India, approximately 53,000 were dead or missing. Most died not in combat, but from starvation and disease. The retreat route was littered with corpses, so many that it became known as the Road of Bones. The battles of Imphal and Kohima were the largest defeat in Japanese military history. They lost an entire army, but more than that, they lost the initiative in Burma forever. From July 1944 onward, there would be no more Japanese offensives, no more bold gambits, only grinding retreat as Slim's 14th Army methodically pushed them back toward Rangoon. The tide had turned, the comeback had begun, and now the question was, could the Allies reconquer Burma before the war ended? The reconquest into the jaws of hell. August 1944. While Allied forces in Europe were liberating France, a very different campaign was beginning in the jungles of Burma. Slim's plan for reconquest was methodical and massive. His 14th Army now numbered over 700,000 men, one of the largest armies in the world. It included British, Indian, Gurkha, African, and Chinese divisions. It had thousands of trucks, tanks, and aircraft. It had confidence. But reconquering Burma meant advancing through terrain that hadn't gotten any easier. The jungles were still impenetrable. The mountains were still impassable. The diseases were still deadly. And the Japanese were still willing to fight to the death. Slim's genius was in how he approached these problems. First, logistics. He built supply lines that could sustain massive armies in the jungle. Truck convoys rumbled down newly built roads. Air supply became routine. Thousands of tons of supplies dropped by parachute or landed on improvised airstrips carved from jungle. Entire field hospitals could be supplied by air. Second, medical care. Slim's medical services were revolutionary. Malaria rates were slashed through aggressive use of anti-malarial drugs, mosquito control, and better sanitation. Wounded men were evacuated by air within hours. Soldiers knew that if they were hit, they'd get world-class medical care. That knowledge itself boosted morale. Third, tactics. The 14th Army learned to use the jungle instead of fighting against it. They infiltrated around Japanese positions instead of attacking them frontally. They cut Japanese supply lines and let starvation do the work. They used air power not just for bombing, but for close air support, with fighters and bombers working in coordination with ground troops. Fourth, combined arms. British tanks, Indian infantry, Gurkha scouts, African artillery, and air support all worked together in carefully coordinated attacks. The Japanese had no answer to this level of integration. The advance began in December 1944. Multiple columns pushed south from India into Burma. The Japanese fought desperate defensive battles, but they were slowly being ground down. The crossing of the Irrawaddy River in February 1945 was a masterpiece of military deception. Slim feinted toward Mandalay while his main force crossed the river 90 miles to the south, then raced for Meiktila, a critical Japanese supply hub. The capture of Meiktila cut the Japanese forces in Burma in half. Units in northern Burma were severed from those in the south. The Japanese staged furious counterattacks to recapture Meiktila, but Slim's forces held. Meanwhile, Chinese forces pushed south from Yunnan province, reopening the Burma Road. American engineers built the Ledo Road, connecting India to China. The supply line was restored. As Allied forces advanced, they liberated prisoner-of-war camps containing emaciated Allied prisoners who'd been slave labor for the Japanese. They found evidence of atrocities committed against civilians. The brutality of Japanese occupation became clear. By April 1945, the 14th Army was racing for Rangoon before the monsoon hit. If they didn't capture the capital before the rains came, they'd be stuck for months. It became a race against weather as much as against the Japanese. On May 3, 1945, British forces entered Rangoon. The Japanese had already evacuated. The capital was liberated not through brutal fighting, but through maneuver and speed, the ultimate vindication of Slim's operational art. The Burma Campaign was effectively over. The Japanese forces still in Burma were cut off, starving, and being hunted through the jungle. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, approximately 100,000 Japanese soldiers remained in Burma, most of them sick, hungry, and surrounded. The British had done it. They'd taken back Burma. They'd avenged the humiliation of 1942. They'd pulled off one of World War II's most remarkable comebacks. But the cost had been staggering. The Butcher's Bill. Let's talk about what this war actually cost. The Burma Campaign lasted from January 1942 to August 1945. 3.5 years of continuous combat in the worst conditions imaginable. British and Commonwealth forces suffered approximately 71,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. But that's only combat casualties. Disease casualties were far higher. For every man killed in action, 3 were evacuated due to disease. Malaria, dysentery, typhus, and other tropical diseases infected hundreds of thousands. Indian Army casualties were particularly heavy. Indians made up the majority of the 14th Army and bore the brunt of the fighting. These were professional soldiers, many from martial tradition communities who fought with extraordinary bravery in conditions that were often suicidal. Chinese forces fighting in Burma suffered approximately 60,000 casualties. Many of these troops had walked hundreds of miles from China to fight in Burma, poorly equipped and poorly supplied, even by Burma standards. American casualties were relatively light, about 2,400, but concentrated in elite units like Merrill's Marauders, who suffered 93% casualty rates from combat and disease combined. Japanese casualties were catastrophic. Of approximately 300,000 Japanese soldiers who served in Burma during the campaign, over 185,000 died, a 60% death rate. Most died not from combat, but from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. The Japanese military's contempt for logistics and willingness to sacrifice soldiers needlessly made the Burma campaign especially deadly for them. But military casualties were only part of the story. Civilian casualties in Burma were enormous, though exact numbers will never be known. Hundreds of thousands died during the Japanese occupation from forced labor, starvation, disease, and direct violence. Ethnic minorities like the Karen people, who often sided with the British, faced brutal Japanese reprisals. The 1942 retreat from Burma killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 Indian and Anglo-Indian refugees who tried to walk out. They died on jungle trails, in rivers, in mountain passes, victims of exhaustion, starvation, disease, and Japanese air attacks. The economic cost was equally devastating. Burma's infrastructure was destroyed. Railways, roads, bridges, ports, and cities were wrecked by bombing and scorched earth tactics employed by both sides. Rangoon was heavily bombed. Agricultural production collapsed, leading to famine. And then there's the cost that's hardest to measure, the psychological and political impact. For Britain, the humiliation of 1942 accelerated the end of empire. British prestige in Asia never recovered. The populations of British Asian colonies had watched their supposedly superior rulers run away from an Asian army. Anti-colonial movements gained momentum. Within 2 years of the war's end, India, Burma, and other colonies would demand and win independence. For Japan, Burma was a disaster that demonstrated the bankruptcy of their military philosophy. The insane logistics of Operation U-Go, where commanders sent men to die of starvation rather than admit defeat, showed how Imperial Japanese Army culture valued glory over reality. For the soldiers who fought there, Burma left deep scars. Veterans spoke of the jungle with a mixture of horror and dark pride. They'd survived conditions that seemed unsurvivable. They'd fought in a campaign that the world largely ignored. They became the forgotten army, forgotten by newspapers, forgotten by the public, but never forgotten by each other. William Slim would later write in his memoir, Defeat into Victory, that the Burma campaign was won by the toughest soldiers in the world. And he wasn't exaggerating. Why it mattered. Here's the big question. Did any of this actually matter? Was Burma worth the cost? The answer is absolutely yes, and the reasons might surprise you. First, China stayed in the war. The Burma campaign kept supply lines to China open, first by air over the hump, then by reopening the Burma Road. Those supplies kept the nationalist Chinese government from collapsing. If China had fallen, Japan could have redeployed over 1 million soldiers from China to the Pacific. Those soldiers could have made every island invasion from Iwo Jima to Okinawa exponentially bloodier. They might have forced the Allies to use even more atomic bombs. The entire endgame of the Pacific War would have been different. Second, India was saved. If Japan had won at Imphal and Kohima, the invasion of India would have become a real possibility. British control of India was already shaky. Anti-colonial sentiment was rising, and figures like Subhas Chandra Bose were organizing Indian forces to fight alongside Japan. A Japanese invasion combined with an internal uprising could have toppled British rule. The political and humanitarian consequences would have been catastrophic. Third, modern special operations were born. The Chindits, Merrill's Marauders, and other deep penetration units pioneered techniques that became standard. Long-range patrols, air supply, operating behind enemy lines, multi-ethnic special forces. Modern special operations, from the SAS to Delta Force to Navy SEALs, owe a debt to what was learned in Burma's jungles. Fourth, air supply was proven. The Burma Campaign demonstrated that large forces could be sustained entirely by air. The siege of Imphal, where 150,000 troops were supplied by air for months, proved the concept. This experience directly influenced the Berlin airlift and every military air supply operation since. Fifth, multi-ethnic armies work. Slim's 14th Army was one of history's most diverse military forces. British, Indian, Gurkha, African, Burmese, and Chinese troops all fought together with mutual respect. In an era of colonial racism, this was revolutionary. It proved that professional armies could transcend ethnicity and nationality, a lesson that shaped post-war military integration. Sixth, the end of empire was accelerated. The Burma Campaign exposed the weakness of European colonialism. Asian troops had watched Europeans retreat in chaos. They'd seen that Western powers were not invincible. When Indian Army veterans returned home, they brought with them the knowledge that British rule depended on consent, not superiority. Within 2 years, India was independent. Burma followed. The entire colonial system in Asia collapsed. So, yes, Burma mattered. It mattered strategically, tactically, politically, and historically. But there's one more reason it matters. It's a story that deserves to be remembered. The Forgotten Army. Today, if you ask random people about World War II in Asia, they'll mention Pearl Harbor, Midway, Hiroshima, maybe Iwo Jima, or Okinawa. Very few will mention Burma. The Burma Campaign was forgotten even while it was happening. British and American newspapers barely covered it. The public was focused on Europe, on D-Day, the liberation of Paris, the drive into Germany. Burma was too remote, too complicated, too unimportant to the folks back home. Even the soldiers fighting there knew they were forgotten. They called themselves the Forgotten Army, with bitter irony. They joked that Burma stood for be underpaid, rarely mentioned, always forgotten. But within that joke was pride. They knew they were doing something extraordinary. They knew they were fighting in conditions worse than anywhere else. They knew they'd turned defeat into victory through sheer grit and determination. William Slim understood this. After the war, he made sure their story was told. His memoir, Defeat into Victory, is one of the great military histories, honest about failures, generous about successes, and always focused on the ordinary soldiers who did the actual fighting. Veterans of the Burma Campaign formed associations, held reunions, and kept the memory alive among themselves. In Britain, Indian, and across the Commonwealth, monuments were erected, Not grand or flashy, but dignified reminders that these men had served and suffered. In Burma itself, the memory is more complicated. The Japanese occupation was brutal, but it also sparked Burmese nationalism. The Burma Independence Army initially fought alongside Japan before switching sides. After independence in 1948, Burma's leaders tried to navigate between honoring all sides while building a new national identity. Today, the battlefields are largely unmarked. The jungle has reclaimed most of them. The roads built by military engineers are overgrown or crumbling. The airfields are abandoned. Nature has erased the scars. But in military history books, the Burma Campaign is studied intensely. Military officers study Slim's operational art. Special forces study Wingate's innovations. Logistics officers study the air supply operations. The lessons learned in Burma shaped modern warfare, and in recent years, there's been a small resurgence of interest. Historians have written new books. Documentaries have been produced. Veterans' oral histories have been recorded before it's too late. Because this story, this 3-year slugfest in the jungle that almost nobody remembers, this story is worth remembering. The Final Reckoning. Let me leave you with one image that captures the entire Burma campaign. It's May 1945. A British soldier is standing in Rangoon, the city they'd abandoned in humiliation 3 years earlier. He's thin from malaria. His uniform is rotting from the humidity. His boots are falling apart. He's probably Indian or Gurkha or African, one of the men who did most of the fighting and got least of the credit. Behind him is a city that's been bombed, fought over, and occupied by 2 different armies. Ahead of him is a future that will see him go home to a country that's about to become independent, where the empire he fought for is about to dissolve. But right now, in this moment, he's a symbol of something remarkable. He represents the longest retreat and longest advance in British military history. He represents defeat transformed into victory through leadership, innovation, and sheer determination. He represents multi-ethnic cooperation in an era of colonial racism. He represents the birth of modern special operations and air supply. He represents the war that decided Asia's fate. If Japan had won in Burma, the map of the modern world would look completely different. China might have fallen, freeing 1 million Japanese soldiers. India might have been invaded, toppling British rule amid chaos. The Pacific War might have lasted years longer, costing millions more lives. Instead, through fighting in conditions that were literally hell on earth, jungles, diseases, mountains, monsoons, and an enemy that refused to surrender, Allied forces won. They kept China in the war. They saved India. They pioneered military innovations. And they accelerated the end of European colonialism in Asia. The Burma Campaign was the forgotten war. But it was also the war that changed everything. Those soldiers who fought there, who died in jungle clearings and mountain passes and disease wards, who suffered through the worst conditions of any World War II theater, they earned better than to be forgotten. They earned their place in history, and their story, this story of defeat, survival, innovation, and ultimate victory, deserves to be told. Because sometimes the battles that shape the world aren't the famous ones with the monuments and the movies. Sometimes they're the ones fought in the green hell of the jungle, witnessed by almost no one, remembered by even fewer. But they matter all the same. This was the Burma Campaign, the war that saved Asia, the war the world forgot, but we remember.